The pre-dawn air over Upper Bavaria was heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of damp pine needles from the surrounding forests. Inside the concrete annex of Block 5, however, the environment was governed by a different, entirely synthetic climate. A large, insulated wooden vat, reinforced with zinc sheeting, dominated the center of the room. It was filled to the brim with water drawn from the camp's deep wells, artificially chilled using heavy blocks of industrial ice shipped from the Munich municipal slaughterhouses. Floating on the surface of the dark, agitated water was a layer of crushed ice, keeping the temperature at a precise, unyielding 2.5 degrees Celsius, 36.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Sigmund Rascher stood by the edge of the vat, adjusting the settings on a multi-channel Siemens thermograph. Unlike his previous work with the high-altitude decompression chambers, which relied on the rapid manipulation of air pressure, the hypothermia experiments required a slow, agonizingly deliberate accumulation of data. Beside him stood Dr. Ernst Holzlohner, a professor of physiology from the University of Kiel, who had been flown in by the Luftwaffe High Command to oversee the civilian medical metrics. "The North Sea is a logistical barrier," Holzlohner stated, checking his pocket watch against the laboratory's master clock. "Our pilots survived the shoot-down only to perish within 30 minutes of immersion. The Reich Marshal demands to know the exact metabolic threshold. At what point does the blood temperature render a trained aviator unsalvageable?" "We will have our baseline today," Rascher replied, nodding toward the heavy iron door of the corridor. 2 SS orderlies entered, dragging the first subject of the morning. He was a political prisoner from the occupied territories, categorized under the Nuremberg laws as an asocial. He was young, approximately 24 years old, his frame lean but healthy, selected specifically because a body with low subcutaneous fat would accelerate the cooling process, providing a clean curve on the thermograph without the insulating interference of adipose tissue.
The prisoner was forced into a standard Luftwaffe flight outfit. This was not an act of decency. It was a strict parameter of the trial. The experiment aimed to replicate the exact conditions of a downed fighter pilot: heavy woolen underwear, a summer-weight flight suit, a leather helmet, and a life vest. As the orderlies lifted him toward the edge of the vat, the prisoner caught sight of the ice slurry reflecting the harsh glare of the overhead surgical lamps. He began to twist in their grip, his bare feet slipping against the wet concrete floor. He didn't speak German, but his pleas in broken Czech required no translation. The orderlies ignored him with the practiced efficiency of factory workers loading raw material into a hopper. "Subject weight, 64 kilograms, Rascher dictated to his female secretary, who sat at a small desk in the corner, her fingers poised over a mechanical typewriter. "Clothed in standard winter flying gear. Core temperature before immersion, 37.2 degrees Celsius." With a sudden, coordinated heave, the orderlies lowered the man into the tank. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment the ice-cold water breached the fabric of the flight suit and struck the bare skin of his torso, the prisoner's respiratory system experienced a catastrophic shock. His diaphragm contracted involuntarily, forcing a loud, ragged gasp from his lungs as the cold shock response took hold. His heart rate, tracked via insulated copper wires running from electrodes on his chest to the Siemens monitor, spiked from 80 beats per minute to an alarming 160. "Note the immediate hyperventilation," Holzlohner observed, leaning over the tank to watch the subject's face. The man's jaw was locked, his teeth chattering with a frantic, metallic click that echoed off the damp walls. "The peripheral blood vessels are contracting. The body is attempting to..." "The hands must remain immersed," Rascher told the secretary. "Every surface area must be exposed to the medium. If he holds the rim, he alters the thermal conductive dynamics." Within 5 minutes, the initial panic subsided into an unsettling, rhythmic shivering. The water around the prisoner's neck rippled with the high-frequency vibration of his muscles, a desperate, automatic attempt by his body to generate kinetic heat. His lips had already turned a deep, bruised indigo, and his eyes, wide with the terror of an animal caught in a trap, remained locked on the face of the doctor, who stood above him with a clipboard, waiting for the cold to reach his blood. August 15th, 1942, 6 a.m., Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. 30 minutes had passed since initial immersion, and the high-frequency shivering that had initially churned the surface of the water began to slow. The human body's defense mechanisms are finite. Once the glycogen stores in the muscles are depleted, the shivering response fails. The water around the prisoner's neck grew still again, broken only by the sluggish, erratic ripples of his shallow breathing. Dr. Rascher adjusted a dial on the seaman's thermograph. A specialized rubber-coated probe had been inserted deep into the subject's rectum prior to immersion, wired directly to a recording stylus that traced a jagged, downward line on a spool of graph paper. Core temperature has breached the 34-degree threshold, Rascher announced, his tone matching the steady hum of the laboratory ventilation. 33.8 degrees Celsius, 92.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Note the cessation of voluntary muscle control. Inside the tank, the Czech prisoner's head drifted backward, his chin pointing toward the ceiling. The leather flight helmet was saturated, weighing his head down. He was no longer clawing at the zinc rim. His fingers had curled into rigid blue claws that drifted uselessly in the ice slurry. The intense pain of the first 15 minutes, the sensation of thousands of frozen needles piercing the skin, had faded into a profound, heavy numbness. Anesthesia dolorosa. The cold was now numbing the very nerves it was destroying. The cognitive decline is becoming pronounced, Dr. Holzlaner observed, tapping his fountain pen against the rim of the vat. He leaned down, his face inches from the prisoner's pale, frosted cheek. Subject, look at me. State your number. The prisoner's eyes rolled lazily toward the sound of the German voice. His pupils were widely dilated, sluggishly responding to the harsh overhead light. He attempted to move his jaw, but the muscles of his face were stiffened by the cold. A thick, viscous saliva dribbled from the corner of his mouth, trailing into the dark water. Only a low, guttural murmur escaped his throat, a formless syllable buried under the weight of an encroaching coma.
Dysarthria is absolute, Holzlohner noted. The speech centers are failing as cerebral blood flow drops. Rascher, look at the cardiac tracing. On the wall-mounted monitor, the clean, rhythmic spikes of the electrocardiograph had deteriorated into an erratic, wide, complex rhythm. The heart rate had plummeted from its initial panic-induced spike down to 45 beats per minute. The cold blood from the extremities was now returning to the body's core, dropping the temperature of the myocardium and disrupting the delicate electrical pathways that dictated the heartbeat. The sinoatrial node is losing its dominance, Rascher muttered, tracing the paper strip with his finger. We are seeing the early stages of atrial fibrillation. This is the critical zone for the Luftwaffe. If a pilot is pulled from the ocean at this stage, his heart is like glass. A sudden movement, a rough handling by the rescue crew, can jar the myocardium into a fatal ventricular spasm. The secretary's typewriter clacked rhythmically, capturing the conversion of human agony into mathematical intervals. Rascher stepped closer to the tank, a long glass thermometer in hand to cross-check the digital readings. He fished for the prisoner's arm, lifting it out of the water. The flesh was pale, with a marble-like patterning, livido reticularis, caused by the stagnant, unoxygenated blood pooling in the capillaries. When he pressed his thumb into the forearm, the indentation remained, the frozen tissue losing its natural elasticity.
August 15th, 1942, 06:35 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The room grew colder as the ice blocks inside the vat melted further, transferring their latent heat to the dying prisoner's slumber. The Cheyne-Stokes breathing cycle grew longer, the periods of apnea stretching to 15, 20, then 25 seconds of absolute stillness. The secretary sat motionless, her fingers hovering above the keys of the mechanical typewriter, waiting for the next rasping breath to shatter the silence of the annex. Core temperature, 31.0 degrees Celsius, Rascher reported, his finger following the red ink curve on the thermograph. We have entered the zone of absolute rigidity. Inside the water, the Czech prisoner's body had undergone a terrifying transformation. The flaccid helplessness of the previous half hour had vanished, replaced by an intense, unnatural muscular stiffness. The cold had penetrated deep into the skeletal muscle tissue, causing an involuntary crystallization of intracellular fluid and a profound, sustained contraction known as cold rigor. His arms were locked tightly across his chest, his fingers bent into rigid, immobile hooks that looked like gray stone. Dr. Holzlohner leaned over the zinc tank, grasping the subject's jaw. He tried to pull it down, but the masseter muscles were frozen.
Look at the ocular reflexes, Rasher murmured, pulling a small silver flashlight from his apron pocket. He pried back the prisoner's frozen eyelid. The conjunctiva was injected with burst capillaries, a lattice of deep crimson against a stark white background. The pupil was completely dilated, fixed, dead to the light. The beam from Rasher's flashlight cast a sharp reflection off the glazed, drying cornea, but the iris did not flinch. To any conventional medical doctor, this was the universal sign of brain death. But on the Siemens monitor, the jagged, distorted spikes of the electrocardiograph showed that the heart was still fighting, a desperate, losing battle. The pulse is down to 22 beats per minute, Rasher said, checking the carotid artery with his gloved fingers. He had to press deep into the frozen tissue of the neck to find the faint, sluggish thud of the artery. The blood has thickened to a sludge. The hematocrit level must be astronomical. The heart is trying to pump cold oil through constricted pipes. Suddenly, the monitor emitted a long, chaotic whine. The wide, slow electrical complexes vanished, replaced by a frantic, disorganized sawtooth pattern. Atrial fibrillation has converted to ventricular fibrillation, Holzlohner warned, his voice rising slightly. The myocardium is dying, Rasher. If we intend to test the survival limits and the rewarming protocols, the subject must be extracted now. Once total cardiac arrest occurs, the tissues degrade too rapidly for a viable therapeutic assessment. No, Rasher commanded, his hand extended to stop Holzlohner from reaching for the extraction pulleys. The Luftwaffe does not land its rescue boats the exact moment a pilot loses consciousness or experiences an arrhythmia. We must simulate a prolonged rescue.
August 15th, 1942, 6:52 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The 10 minutes of mandatory delay passed with the agonizing weight of a death sentence. The mechanical typewriter sat silent. There were no more physiological shifts to log, only the stagnation of a dying organism. On the wall, the Siemens monitor no longer produced the frantic sawtooth pattern of fibrillation. The electrical impulses had flattened into a lazy, agonal line. Occasional, uncoordinated microvoltages that flickered across the screen like the dying embers of a fire. 10 minutes achieved, Rasher said, his voice flat. He clicked his stopwatch open and shut. Core temperature has stabilized at 29.4 degrees Celsius. The baseline of terminal exposure is established. He gestured to the two SS orderlies. Extract the subject. Move him to the resuscitation platform immediately. The machinery of the annex groaned as the iron pulleys were engaged. The hooks were secured to the life vest and the harness of the Luftwaffe flight suit. With a wet, heavy splash, the body of the Czech prisoner was hoisted out of the ice-choked vat. The water cascaded off the saturated wool and leather, pattering against the concrete floor like heavy rain. The man was completely rigid. Because of the cold rigor, his limbs remained locked in the exact shape of the tank. His knees were bent, his arms crossed over his chest, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, as if he were still fighting to keep his nose above the ice slurry. He resembled a gray, waterlogged statue rather than a human being. The orderly swung the hoist over to a heavy zinc-top table equipped with drainage channels.
They dropped him onto the metal surface with a hollow, metallic thud. "Begin the post-immersion measurements," Dr. Holtzlohner instructed, stepping up to the table with a surgical tray. He reached for a long, wide-bore needle attached to a glass syringe. "We need a direct puncture of the right ventricle to determine the oxygen saturation of the stagnant blood before any rewarming is attempted." Rascher didn't wait for the blood draw. He walked over to the secretary's desk, looking over her shoulder at the neatly typed charts. "The data confirms our hypothesis from the July trials. Once the internal temperature drops below 30 degrees, the cerebral cortex enters a state of irreversible paralysis. However, the autonomic nervous system, specifically the cardiac pacemaker centers in the bundle of His, can maintain a residual, non-functional electrical charge for up to 15 minutes post-apparent death." Behind him, Holtzlohner drove the long needle through the prisoner's fourth intercostal space. The sound of the metal piercing the frozen, dense skin and chest muscle was sharp, followed by a wet hiss as the vacuum of the syringe drew a thick, dark, almost black blood from the heart.
"The blood is heavily hemolyzed," Holtzlohner muttered, holding the glass syringe up to the electric light. The fluid was viscous, sluggishly clinging to the glass walls. The red blood cells are rupturing from the thermal shock. Even if we restart the pump, the oxygen-carrying capacity of this sludge is severely compromised. This is what kills the pilots within minutes of rescue. The afterdrop of cold, acidic blood returning from the limbs to the core. Rascher returned to the table, his rubber apron smeared with the condensation from the vat. He checked the prisoner's pulse points one last time. There was nothing. The carotid was silent. The femoral artery felt like a cold cord beneath the saturated cloth of the flight suit. "The subject is clinically dead by all traditional Luftwaffe metrics," Rascher recorded, speaking loudly so the secretary could hear over the sound of the draining water. "We will now initiate Phase 2 of the experimental protocol, comparative evaluation of resuscitation methods. The Reichshauptamt requires definitive proof regarding the efficiency of rapid thermal reintroduction versus conservative warming." He turned toward the back of the room, where two large canvas-shrouded objects sat under the steam pipes. "Today, we test the aggressive extreme. Prepare the boiling vat."
August 15th, 1942, 07:02 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The canvas shroud was yanked away to reveal a second zinc tank, identical in size to the first, but radically different in purpose. This vat was hooked directly to the camp's industrial steam line. The water inside did not shimmer with ice. It rumbled and roiled with heavy, aggressive convective currents, heated to a lethal 50 degrees Celsius. A dense, humid vapor rose from the surface, instantly condensing on the cold concrete walls and dripping down like sweat. "We are testing the extreme rapid reheating theory," Dr. Holtzlohner noted, stepping back as the steam clouded his spectacles. "Conventional medical doctrine dictates a slow, gradual warming using blankets to avoid vascular collapse. But a pilot rescued from the North Sea does not have hours to thaw. If his core is frozen, we must force the heat back into his center by brute physical force." "Engage the hoist," Rascher commanded, indifference thick in his voice. The orderly swung the pulley arm over the boiling vat. The frozen, rigid body of the Czech prisoner, still clad in the sodden, ice-crusted Luftwaffe flight suit, rose into the humid air. He hovered over the steaming cauldron for a fraction of a second, a stark gray silhouette of locked joints and blue skin, before the brake on the winch was released. The body hit the hot water with a massive, heavy splash. What followed was a horrific manifestation of thermodynamic physics acting upon a dying organism. The extreme temperature differential, a violent jump of over 20 degrees Celsius between the water and the prisoner's frozen skin, triggered an instantaneous, catastrophic reaction. The remaining gas and moisture inside the layers of the flight suit expanded violently, causing the fabric to balloon outward before collapsing as the boiling water saturated the wall. On the Siemens monitor, the flatline didn't stay flat. It exploded into a chaotic, erratic frenzy of high-voltage spikes. "The heart," Holtzlohner shouted, leaning over the monitor. "Is it a sinus rhythm?" "No," Rascher countered coldly, squinting through the rising steam at the tank.
It is not a heartbeat. It is pseudo-rigor. The extreme heat is denaturing the proteins in the skeletal muscles. The muscle fibers are shortening, cooking, twisting the limbs by force. Inside the boiling vat, the frozen statue was moving. The intense heat was penetrating the outer layers of flesh, causing the locked, rigid muscles to violently contract and snap. The prisoner's arms, which had been frozen across his chest, jerked outward, his hands clawing at the boiling water as if he had suddenly returned to life. His knees snapped toward his abdomen, and his head yanked forward, his jaw bursting open with a sickening, wet pop as the frozen masseter muscles were torn apart by the heat contraction.
The skin is blistered, Rasher noted, leaning over the edge with his clipboard, completely unbothered by the boiling spray. Massive erythematous lesions forming across the neck and face. The peripheral capillaries are bursting from the rapid expansion of stagnant blood. He reached down with a pair of long iron tongs, pulling the flight suit's collar back to expose the neck. The skin was changing color in real time, turning from a dead, marbly gray to a raw, angry purple red as the boiling water cooked the tissue. "Look at the thermograph," Holzlohner urged, pointing to the red ink line. The rectal probe was transmitting a rapid rise, but it wasn't a healthy recovery. The core temperature was jumping by a full degree every 60 seconds. The heat is rushing toward the center, but it is too fast. The internal organs are being scalded, while the brainstem remains hypoxemic. The frantic, jagged lines on the electrocardiograph suddenly began to shrink, collapsing back down into a low, trembling vibration. Ventricular fibrillation turning into permanent electromechanical dissociation. The violent muscle spasms in the water slowed, the cooked limbs loosening as the proteins fully broken down under the heat. The body drifted face down in the steaming vat, the life vest keeping the red, blistered head afloat in the boiling mist, while the secretary's typewriter logged the failure of the first rewarming trial.
August 15th, 1942, 07:45 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The steam from the boiling vat was slowly cleared by the extractor fans, leaving behind a heavy, humid warmth that clung to the concrete floor. The body of the Czech prisoner was removed, a ruined mass of scalded tissue, and wheeled out to the dissection theater. The zinc tables were scrubbed down, the ice vat replenished with fresh blocks from the slaughterhouse, and the digital thermograph reset to its 0-degree baseline. The rapid thermal shock of the boiling medium is non-viable, Dr. Rasher declared, tossing his ruined notes into a tray. It destroys the vascular architecture before the heart can reestablish a coordinated stroke. We must look to the opposite end of the therapeutic spectrum. He turned to Dr. Holzlohner, who was reviewing a letter bearing the seal of the Reichsfuhrer SS. Himmler is personally obsessed with the concept of animal heat. He believes that nature has provided the most compatible thermal frequency for a freezing man, the touch of another human being.
An archaic theory, Holzlohner muttered, adjusting his spectacles. It contradicts everything we know about thermodynamics. The heat transfer coefficient of air between two skin surfaces is negligible compared to a liquid medium. Nevertheless, the Reichsfuhrer has ordered a comparative trial, Rasher said, a sinister smile touching his lips. He suggested that we utilize camp women to provide this animal warmth. He wants to know if the biological energy, the vis vitalis, can revive a pilot where technology fails. The iron doors opened again, and the second subject of the day was brought in. This prisoner was a Russian soldier, broad-shouldered and physically robust. Like the first, he was forced into the heavy Luftwaffe flight gear and strapped down. The process was repeated with an automated, terrifying regularity. Subject number 2, weight 78 kilograms, core temperature 37.4 degrees Celsius, Rasher dictated.
The pulleys groaned, and the Russian was dropped into the 2.5-degree ice slurry. The same primal panic erupted, the desperate gasps, the frantic clawing at the zinc rim, the high-frequency shivering that eventually faded into the deep, heavy silence of the core descent. Rasher watched the thermograph with an expert eye. He didn't wait for total cardiac arrest this time.
He let the Russians' core temperature drop to exactly 30 degrees Celsius, the absolute edge of consciousness.
"Extract him," Rasher ordered at the 90-minute mark. "He is sufficiently chilled. Bring in the warmers."
The rigid, shivering form of the Russian soldier was hoisted out and laid upon a large wooden platform covered in heavy wool blankets. Simultaneously, 2 female prisoners, selected from the Ravensbrück concentration camp and brought to Dachau under armed guard, were forced into the room. They were stripped entirely naked, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and humiliation under the harsh glare of the surgical lamps.
"Place them on either side of the subject," Rasher commanded the orderlies. "They must press their bodies directly against his torso. Cover the entire group with the wool blankets to prevent environmental heat loss." The women climbed onto the platform, trembling. They pressed their warm, living skin against the icy, waterlogged wool of the flight suit, which had been deliberately left on the prisoner to simulate a real rescue scenario. The Russian man was unconscious, his skin blue and marble-patterned, his breathing a faint, periodic rattle. "Note the time of contact," Rasher told the secretary. "We will now measure the rate of thermal transfer from 2 healthy female bodies to a hypothermic male core. Let us see if the Reichsfuhrer's mysticism holds up to the scrutiny of the graph."
August 15th, 1942, 8:30 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The heavy wool blankets formed a tent over the 3 figures on the wooden platform, trapping the damp, freezing air rising from the Russian soldier's flight suit. Inside that dark canopy, a silent, desperate struggle of thermodynamics was underway. The 2 women from Ravensbrück lay perfectly still, their skin goose-pimpled and shivering from the immediate draining shock of pressing against what felt like a corpse sculpted from ice. Dr. Rasher stood by the Siemens thermograph, his eyes fixed on the ink stylus. The line was agonizingly flat. 45 minutes post-contact, Rasher noted, his pencil tapping against his clipboard. The core temperature of the subject has risen by only 0.3 degrees Celsius. The rate of transfer is mathematically insufficient. "It is exactly as I predicted," Dr. Holzlohner said, stepping up to the platform and lifting the edge of the blanket. The humid odor of cold sweat and wet wool escaped. He placed his gloved hand on the exposed shoulder of one of the women. Her skin was markedly cool to the touch. "The subject is acting as a heat sink. He is not warming up. Rather, the women are cooling down. Their peripheral vasculature is constricting to protect their own cores. They cannot generate enough surplus caloric energy to alter the mass of a frozen adult male."
The Russian soldier remained deep in his comatose state. His breathing was so shallow that it barely rippled the blanket resting over his chest. Every few minutes, a violent, isolated tremor would rack his torso, a residual reflex of his dying nervous system attempting to ignite a metabolic spark.
"Subject's pulse is irregular, hovering at 28 beats per minute," Rasher dictated to the secretary. "The animal heat method, as currently applied through clothed to naked skin contact, demonstrates an ineffective thermal recovery curve. The heat transfer is hindered significantly by the saturated flight uniform." One of the women looked up from beneath the blanket, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a quiet, hollow desperation. "He is getting colder," she whispered in German, her voice trembling violently. "He feels like stone. Please."
Rasher didn't look at her face. He only looked at her shoulder, where it met the blue, mottled flesh of the soldier's neck. "Remove the uniform," Rasher ordered the orderlies suddenly. "We will eliminate the textile barrier, strip the subject entirely, and reintroduce the women. If the Reichsfuhrer's hypothesis is to be thoroughly tested for the Luftwaffe, we must evaluate the absolute maximum coefficient of skin-to-skin conduction." The orderlies stepped forward, ruthlessly pulling back the blankets. They used heavy shears to slice through the stiffened, ice-cold layers of the Luftwaffe flight suit, peeling the wet wool away from the Russian's rigid limbs like bark from a tree. His bare body was laid flat on the platform, stark, blue,
and shivering in erratic, violent bursts. The women were forced back onto the wood, instructed to wrap their arms and legs completely around his torso, pinning his frozen chest between their own living bodies.
Note the alteration in protocol, Rasher murmured to the secretary, the keys of the typewriter clacking instantly in response. Subject is now completely denuded. Direct cutaneous contact initiated at 0842 a.m. Let us see if the blood of the Reichsmarshal's pilots can be warmed by the flesh of the Untermenschen. August 15th, 1942, 9:15 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The change in the experimental design yielded an immediate, microscopic shift on the Siemens thermograph. With the wet wool barrier removed, the direct contact between the skin surfaces allowed for a more direct thermodynamic interaction. The red ink stylus, which had stagnated for nearly an hour, began a painfully slow, incremental climb. Core temperature has shifted from 30.3 to 31.1 degrees Celsius, Rasher observed, squinting at the paper feed. An increase of 0.8 degrees over a 30-minute interval. It is a measurable acceleration, yet it remains critically slow. Underneath the wool blanket tent, the atmosphere had become a suffocating pocket of damp heat and exhaustion. The two women had been holding the frozen Russian soldier for nearly 3/4 of an hour. The physical toll of the experiment was now writing itself across their own bodies. Their breathing had become rapid and shallow, and their lips bore a faint bluish tint as their systems continuously shunted their own warm blood away from their skin to protect their vital organs from the massive thermal drain. Dr. Holzlohner pulled back the corner of the blanket, examining the Russian's bare chest. The skin is showing signs of localized rewarming where the direct pressure is greatest, he noted, pointing to patches of pink flesh amidst the wider expanse of blue, marbled mottling. But look at the extremities. The feet and hands are completely excluded from this arrangement. They remain in a state of advanced frostbite.
The Russian soldier's eyelids suddenly fluttered. The slight rise in core temperature was beginning to awaken the higher structures of his brainstem from their deep hypoxemic hibernation. A low, long groan escaped his lips, not a conscious statement, but a primal vocalization of returning neurological function. His jaw, previously locked by the cold rigor, loosened slightly, allowing a bloody foam to bubble over his teeth.
But look at the cost to the donors, Holzlohner countered, pointing to the younger of the two women. Her body was shaking so violently that her teeth were clicking in a frantic, erratic rhythm that mimicked the early stages of the prisoner's own immersion. Their internal temperatures are dropping toward the clinical border of mild hypothermia. If we continue this path to achieve a full restoration to 37 degrees, we will likely end up with 3 casualties instead of 1.
The survival of the donors is irrelevant to the Luftwaffe, Rasher replied, his voice clipped and dry. He turned to the secretary. Type this. Skin-to-skin rewarming provides a gentle, non-shock thermal reintroduction that prevents the immediate ventricular fibrillation seen in the boiling trials. However, the time required for complete resuscitation renders the method completely unviable for military application, where rapid turnaround of rescued personnel is required. He stood up, stretching his back after hours of leaning over the platforms. He looked at the Russian soldier, whose groan had subsided back into a heavy, irregular rattle.
The experiment with animal heat has served its bureaucratic purpose, Rasher said, glancing at the clock on the wall. We have proven the Reichsfuhrer's theory to be a romantic inefficiency. Now, we will combine the two methods. We will remove the women and submerge this subject into a temperate bath to see if a middle ground exists, or if he, too, will fail under the weight of the afterdrop.
August 15th, 1942, 9:40 a.m. Dachau concentration camp, Block 5 Annex. The two women from Ravensbrück were detached from the platform.
their limbs stiff and trembling as the SS orderly shoved them back toward their clothes. They had been drained of their own vital warmth, discarded the moment their data points were logged. The Russian soldier lay exposed on the wooden boards, his skin glistening with a film of cold sweat and condensation. "Prepare the third vat," Dr. Roscher directed, pointing toward a smaller iron basin against the far wall. "Set the water to precisely 38 degrees Celsius. We will test a controlled, temperate rewarming. Neither the shock of the boiling cauldron nor the stagnation of human flesh." The orderlies lifted the Russian by his armpits and knees. His body was no longer stone-rigid, but it possessed a heavy, flaccid mass, his muscles completely exhausted from the prolonged exposure. They lowered him into the lukewarm water.
For the first 3 minutes, the Siemens thermograph appeared to indicate a successful compromise. The core temperature held steady at 31.2 degrees. But Dr. Holzlohner was not watching the red ink line. His eyes were glued to the mercury columns of the blood pressure apparatus hooked to the subject's brachial artery. "The pressure is cratering, Roscher," Holzlohner warned, his finger tracing the rapidly dropping column. 100/60, 80/40. It is falling into the floor. "The afterdrop effect," Roscher muttered, stepping closer. The temperate water had triggered a massive, sudden dilation of the blood vessels in the Russian's frozen arms and legs. The stagnant, ice-cold, highly acidic blood that had been trapped in his extremities for over 2 hours was now rushing back into his core circulation all at once. It was a toxic wave of lactic acid and carbon dioxide, chilling the heart from the inside out, even as the external water tried to warm it. On the wall monitor, the steady, slow heartbeat suddenly fractured. The complexes widened, distorted by the sudden drop in pH and temperature within the right atrium. The Russian's chest heaved, once, twice, a violent, airless gasp, and then his head fell sideways into the water. "Total vascular collapse," Holzlohner stated, stripping off his surgical gloves and tossing them onto the tray with a sharp clatter. "The peripheral dilation has robbed the brain of its remaining perfusion pressure. The heart cannot pump against a wide-open, unpressurized system." Roscher did not try to lift the man's head. He simply checked his watch, noting the exact time of cardiac cessation. "A highly informative failure," he said to the secretary, who was already typing the conclusion. "Log it. Temperate rewarming induces a lethal internal temperature drop via peripheral vascular relaxation. The cold blood of the extremities acts as a secondary internal shock, terminating cardiac function before metabolic recovery can occur." August 15th, 1942, 11:15 a.m. The aftermath. The laboratories of Block 5 were finally quiet. The ice vats were being drained via the floor channels, the water rushing out into the camp sewer system with a cold, hollow gurgle. The scent of steam, formaldehyde, and wet wool lingered in the air, a permanent residue of the morning's scientific inquiry. Dr. Sigmund Roscher sat at his desk, his fountain pen scratching across the final page of the comprehensive report titled Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter. The document, bound in a crisp manila folder, would be hand-delivered to the Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin within 48 hours. The cost of the morning's data was simple arithmetic. 2 human lives completely dismantled under the guise of military medicine. Over the entire course of the hypothermia trials, between 90 and 100 prisoners would be subjected to the vats. None of their names were recorded in the final military charts. They were represented only by their weights, their body fat percentages, and the jagged lines of their terminal electrocardiographs. The medical community at Dachau had achieved what General Shiro Ishii had accomplished in Manchuria, the absolute industrialization of human torment. The Luftwaffe would use the data to redesign their aviators' life vests and flight suits, adding extra insulation around the neck and brainstem based directly on the precise locations where the Czech and Russian prisoners had frozen first. When the Allied forces liberated Dachau in April 1945, they discovered Rascher's meticulously kept files hidden in the basement of the administration building. The photographs of men freezing in zinc vats,
the typed records of the boiling resuscitations, and the accounts of the naked women from Ravensbrück became foundational evidence during the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946-1947.
The experiments did not lead to a breakthrough in modern medicine. Instead, they established the legal and ethical boundary for the civilized world. The horrifying records of Block 5 gave rise to the Nuremberg Code, a declaration that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. A monument of law built upon the silent, frozen remains of those who were sacrificed to a science without a conscience.